Okay, so we're going to see how this goes. Let's see if this is recording. I've been having trouble. So paleoclimates. Paleoclimates are old climates. Paleo meaning old. Paleontology is studying fossils and dinosaurs and those kinds of things. The geowords we have here: paleoclimate, climate proxy. There are 4 types of climate proxy that we are going to study. I know I keep doing that. And one is tree rings, one is ice cores, one is fossil pollen, and one is deep sea sediment. I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. So what's a paleoclimate? It's the climatic conditions in the geological past reconstructed from a direct or indirect data source. Okay, so we have about 100 years of recorded instrumental data that we have, or even a little more than that when it comes to temperature and precipitation in a lot of areas. But that's all, 100 years. So what we need to do if we want to go further back, we need to find other ways of recording this data or figuring out what the temperatures are like or the precipitation was like. And so we go back into the paleontological records and we do well, these are only 4 examples. There's lots of different ways that they do it. And when you were watching the video on a global warming, you learned about some of them. Okay, so that's kind of a summary of what I said. We only have about 100 years of instrumental data. So what was the climate like thousands of years ago? We use climate proxies. A proxy is a substitute or any feature or set of data that has a predictable relationship to climatic factors and can be used to indirectly measure those factors. So let's give you some examples so you understand what that means. Remember, you need to stop and start so that you can take notes. Climate proxies, tree sediments. The first one we're going to talk about is tree rings. Whoopsies. Tree rings, you've probably heard about this. Basically, they can take a core into the center of a tree, and they can look at that tree ring, and they can estimate based on the patterns, the size of that ring, whether it's really thick or whether it's really thin. They can see if there was a lot of rain, it was thick, it was nice and warm, and a lot of rain, depending on what kind of tree it is. And so they can, depending on the thickness, they can kind of estimate what the climate was like during that time period. Like, you can go back about 1,000 years. It doesn't go very far back because we don't have trees that are much older than that. Okay, so there's a limit to this data. Okay, ice cores, on the other hand, can go back about 400,000 years because glaciers have been around a really long time. Excuse me. An ice core, when you pull it up, there's all sorts of things you can get from it, but a couple of the main things are dust particles that tell you about wind patterns and gases that are trapped in little bubbles in the ice. All right, and it's basically the ancient world. The atmosphere is frozen in that ice. So 2 things they talk about in this. We can find out temperature depending on how much oxygen 18 isotope or oxygen 16 isotope is in the ice core. It tells us whether it's hotter or colder. All right, and it can also tell us if we take those little bubbles, and you see those little air bubbles in here, they go in there and they actually can remove the air from there. It's like ancient atmosphere. And they can figure out how much carbon dioxide, oxygen, and nitrogen. So that's direct, not indirect, that is direct evidence of what the atmosphere was like during that time period. All right, indirect evidence would be saying, let's look at the oxygen 18 and 16 and see how that relates to what the temperature was like. All right, fossil pollen, this is the one we're going to be working on this week. Basically, sediments are laid down in lakes, the bottoms of lakes, the bottoms of the ocean, but this is mostly about lakes. And you can take a core of that sediment and pull it up and look through all of the different layers and count the numbers of pieces of certain types of pollen in that layer. And pollen is basically the seed, not the seed, but the part that combines with the flower in the seed and they make in the plant and they make a seed. So pollen is very, very specific to a particular plant. So it looks this color or this shape, this size of pollen. Pollen will indicate that it has a certain tree. So in your lab, you're going to be looking at flowers and grasses and trees to determine what kind of climate you had. Because if you had more ferns or more, you'd have a moisture climate and a certain type of forest that would grow fern. If you had pollen from a fir tree, you know it's going to be cool and non-deciduous, so it's going to have a certain climate all year round. So pollen is really a good indicator of the local climate. All right. These are sort of what pollen grains look like. You'll look at some more when we get to class, but see, you can tell. I mean, there's different ones in each one. I mean, this one is different from that one, is different from this one, is different from that one, and all these. So they're all there's like 6 or 7 different kinds of pollen in this one microscopic picture of a microscopic pollen. Okay. So what they do is then they say, okay, over time, like 1,000 years ago there were no spruce, but 10,000 years ago there were tons of spruce pollen. All right, so what does that say about the climate? And if you look here, the alder and pine, those go up and down kind of, well, in the beginning they kind of go up and down together. All right, so depending on how much of each kind of plant you're going to have a certain type of climate. Okay. Deep sea sediments is another core sample that they'll get. They'll dig way down, and depending on what kind of what they call foraminifera skeleton. These are like little sand grains, and foraminifera are these little tiny single-celled animals that actually have skeletons, and they swirl. And this one is swirling in a counterclockwise direction. If you see that, it's going counterclockwise. All right. So spiraling in that direction, maybe it's cold. If we have a lot of them spiraling in that direction, it's cold weather. Spiraling in the other direction, it's warmer weather. And depending on percentages, it might be warmer or colder. What we're going to do, another lab we're going to do after we do the pond lab, is a leaf margin lab. Leaf margin is the edges of the leaves, and if it's really jagged, then you are likely. If it's really smooth, you're going to have warmer weather. And depending on the percentages of that, there's actually a graph where you can read off the temperature depending on the percentages of these different leaf types. And if you remember from the video, the guy talked about the little breathing pores in the bottom of the leaves. If there's a lot of them, there's not very much CO2, because that's the way the plant gets the CO2 in to help them do photosynthesis. If there's a lot of CO2, there's not very many of those, because they don't need as many pores to get the same amount of CO2, because there's a higher percentage of CO2 in the atmosphere. Okay, so deep sea sediments, this is, we go down to the deep sea and we take a cross section and go way down and dig up that, because over time all the sediments in the top layers, they float down and then they just accumulate in layer after layer depending on the time period. Okay, so that's kind of like this time period. If we were to figure out what kind of foraminifera in this particular layer, we'd know whether it was warm or cold during that time period. Okay, so please make sure you've taken sufficient notes in addition to your vocabulary, and go back if you need to.